Have you ever wondered who actually wrote the dictionary? I'm talking about the dictionary, the Oxford English Dictionary, the one that tries to track every single word in the English language, where it came from, how it was used, and how it changed over time. It's one of the most ambitious intellectual projects ever attempted, and when the first edition was released in 1928, it took over 70 years to complete. It had over 400,000 words in it with more than 1.8 million quotations, and it was filled with 12 massive volumes that weighed over 150 pounds. And it took over thousands of people, volunteers over generations. But what's even more astonishing than the accomplishment itself is who helped make it happen. Because one of the most important contributors, a man responsible for over 10,000 quotations himself, wasn't a professor from Oxford. He wasn't even free to walk the streets. He was actually locked inside an asylum for the criminally insane, serving a life sentence for murder, and his name was Dr. William Minor. And nearly for 20 years, he worked in total obscurity, sending his findings by post day after day from a small cell in Broadmoor. But no one actually knew who he really was, even the dictionary's editor, who was corresponding with him for over those 20 years, Dr. James Murray, the man in charge of the whole operation. He'd had no idea that he'd been corresponding with a convicted killer. And one of them was working out of a shed filled with paper clips called the scriptorium, where he jotted down every single word by hand. And the other was working in a room with barred windows. And yet together they helped shape one of the greatest works of scholarship the world has ever seen. The story is about how they found each other, but it's also about something a little bit deeper. It's the mix of obsession and redemption, and the strange places purpose can take root, even inside the mind of a man who's lost it all. Because what they were building wasn't just a book, it was a literal map of the English language, a record of how we think, how we speak, and how we make sense of the world. And the man who helped define it had once completely lost his grip on reality. And this is the story of the Professor and the Madman. Now, the story that I'm referencing is from the book, literally called The Professor and the Madman. As I was researching some books and stories to cover on this podcast, I came across this one, and it immediately caught my attention, and for good reason. It's a story of how the Oxford English Dictionary was created by these two guys, and basically they were responsible for a majority of its works, even though it lasted well over 70 years. There's a lot of other contributors, but these two were really responsible for making it happen, especially in, the quote unquote timely fashion that it did, because it would have probably taken well over 100 years to complete without these two. And the story goes into some history of the prior dictionaries that were available and the absolutely insane process it took to make the Oxford English Dictionary, and the story behind the Professor, which is Dr. Murray, and the Madman, which is Dr. Minor, which we'll get into. Now, while I'll do my best to cover the best parts of this book, there's definitely a lot of things I'll leave out in the story. There's a lot of what it took to make the dictionary. I'll add a lot of that into the story here as well. But if you want to get the full scope of it, if you want to read the really interesting story of how it was made and the craziness of the madman, Dr. Murray, or Dr. Minor, I'd highly recommend that you get the book. You could find it in the description below. And if you like this story and you want a little more update on it, you can go to my social links and I'll be posting just kind of stories and things that I learned throughout there. But without wasting your time, let's actually get into the story that you came here for. So, our story starts in the outskirts of London, in a place called Lambeth Marsh. In Victorian London, even in a place as louch and notoriously crime-ridden as Lambeth Marsh, the sound of gunshots was a rare event indeed. The marsh was a sinister place, a jumble of slums and sim that crouched, dark and ogre-like, on the bank of the Thames, just across from the Westminster. Few respectable Londoners would ever admit to venturing there. But it was not a place for men with guns. The armed criminal was a phenomenon little known to the Lambeth of Prime Minister Gladstone's day, and even less known in the entire metropolitan vastness of London. Guns were costly, cumbersome, difficult to use, and hard to conceal. So let's start with the night itself, where it all happened. It's just after 2 a.m. on a cold February morning in 1872. London is mostly asleep except in Lambeth Marsh, a rough part of town, even where Victorian standards, fog lingers, gas lamps flicker, coal dust clings to everything. And George Merrett, a working father of 6 with one on the way, gets a tap on the window. His signal to wake up for the early shift at the Red Lion Brewery. He gets dressed in layers of worn clothes, twine around his ankles to hold up his pants, and steps out into the night. A man then starts to follow him as he's walking to work. And then for some odd reason, he starts chasing him. And then gunfire, one shot, two shot, whiz right past him. And then the third and the fourth catch him in the neck and in the back. Three or four loud cracks echo across the cobblestone alleys. It's so rare to hear a gun in this part of London that a young constable, Henry Tarrant, which is the police back in the London days. I don't know if they're still called that now. He immediately recognizes the sound for what it is. Something terrible had just happened. Now, to really understand what just happened, we need to talk a little bit more about Lambeth so you understand kind of the scenario or where we're at right now. It was this swampy, dangerous, and just far enough outside of London, official London, that the law was, in a sense, optional, right? It was technically part of the Surrey County back then, not London proper, as it says in the book, which made it a playground for everything that the city didn't want to see. Brothels, gangs, pickpocketers, opium dens, cheap booze, and a whole lot of misery and a lot of poverty. It was the kind of place where even criminals looked over their shoulders. But even here, guns were not common. They were expensive, hard to hide, and hard to fire. So when a man was shot in the neck in the middle of the street, I mean, that's a big deal, even in Lambeth, being it is what it is. George Merrett, the guy who got shot, wasn't a criminal. He was just a poor man going to work in the middle of night or in the middle of the morning. And he was just a man in the wrong place in the wrong time. And it goes on to say, by the winter of 1871, George and Eliza had, as was typical for the inhabitants of the dingier quarters of the Victorian London, a very substantial family. Six children, ranging from Clara at nearly 13 years old and Freddie at 12 months. Miss Merrett was about to be confined with her seventh pregnancy. They were a poor family, as were most in Lambeth. George Merrett brought home only 24 shillings a week, a miserable sum even then. With rent payable to the archbishop, and with food needed for the 8 open mouths, there were constrained circumstances indeed. On the Saturday morning, just before 2 a.m., Merrett was awakened by a neighbor tapping on his window as prearranged. He rose from bed, readied himself, and from the dawn shift it was a bitter morning, and he dressed as warmly as he could afford, a threadbare coat over the kind of smock jacket that Victorians called a slop, a tattered gray shirt, coundery trousers tied to the ankle with the twine, heavy socks, and black boots. The clothes were none too clean, but he was to heave coal for the next 8 hours and could not be too bothered with his appearance. And as we mentioned earlier, he was walking to work at 2 a.m. to go to the Red Lion Brewery. And then out of nowhere, this man starts chasing him, an anonymous man that he has no idea who is, and just starts firing at him. The shooter was caught immediately, and there was really no dramatic chase, no standoff, nothing like that. And it goes on to say, the man who was caught says, "Don't handle me," he said, when Tarrant put a hand on his shoulder. But then, rather more gently, he said to the police officer, "You haven't searched me, you know." "I'll do that at the station," replied the constable. "How do you know I don't have another gun, and I might shoot you?" The policeman, pleading imputable, replied that if he had another gun, perhaps he would just be so kind as to keep it in his pocket for the time being. "But I do have a knife," replied the prisoner. "Keep that in your pocket also," said the solid constable. These turned out to be no other That turned out to be no other gun, but a search did turn up a long hunting knife in a leather sheath, strapped to a man's belt behind his back. A surgical instrument, it was explained. "I don't always carry it with me." Tarrant, once he had completed the search, explained to the desk sergeant what had happened on Belvedere Road a few moments before. The pair then sent out formally interviewing the arrested man. Now, that arrested man was Dr. William Chester Minor, an American, a former Army surgeon with a degree from Yale. So the man that they just caught for murdering another man in the street, out of just like, they have no reason why, he was a doctor from Yale who served in the Civil War as an Army, as an assistant surgeon. And he admitted to what he did freely. And then when questioned, he explained, well, he thought George Merrett had broken into his house. He believed that the man that he was chasing and shot down in cold blood had actually been stalking him for months, feeding him poisoned biscuits, crawling into his bed at night, and making what he likes to say, a pimp of him. But none of it was real. And so they take him back to the station, they hole him up for a little bit, and then the trial proceeds in a couple of weeks. And before we actually get into this, like, how crazy were the times right back in the 1800s where this man literally shot another man dead, and as they're taking him to the station, he's just like, "Oh, you haven't checked me for any guns or anything." He's like, "Well, if you could just be so nice to just not pull it out, That would be really cool of you. Like, that would never happen today, but it's just really interesting to see the difference in times, like how everything plays out. And just how laid back the police were with this, because they were just kind of like, what just happened, right? Guns were never used in this time. But a few weeks pass and the trial begins in early April, just weeks after the murder. But it wasn't really the killing that shocked the courtroom. It was actually what came after and during the actual trial. Because while everyone agreed that Dr. Miner had pulled the trigger, him included, the bigger question was why? Why did he shoot this random man in the back of the neck and in the back? And witness after witness painted a portrait of a man who is no longer in control of his mind. And it goes on to say, one inspector from Scotland Yard said Miner had shown up months earlier, well before the murder, convinced that Irish nationalists were trying to poison him. He said that they were breaking into his room at night, hiding in the rafters, slipping poison into his food. Even his jailer, a man named Dennis, described mornings that sounded like scenes from a horror novel. Every day, Miner would wake up accusing Dennis of molesting him in the night, spitting repeatedly to get some imaginary toxin out of his mouth. Then he'd crawl around his bed searching for the intruders he believed to be sneaking in where he slept under his bed. And it wasn't just a recent thing. His own stepbrother testified against him, George Miner, and he said that William had been like this for years. Back in New Haven in America, like somewhere in Connecticut or New Hampshire, somewhere around there, before he even left America, he was already unraveling, accusing strangers of crawling into his room, whispering about metallic viscous coated in poison, haunted by some secret sins he believed he committed during his time in the army. And to him, when he came, so you can already see this is a troubled man, like something's going on in his head. Something's just not right with this guy. He's a little bit paranoid. And we'll kind of give it into it. It'll make a little bit more sense here. But eventually what happened is Dr. Miner went to Europe because he just kind of wanted to escape. He was in America, he was having a hard time, and what actually turned out is he spent 18 months in a mental asylum before coming to Europe. Once he served his 18 months, he fled to Europe to kind of get like a fresh start. But instead, it became the stage for this breakdown. And by the end of the trial, there wasn't really much for the jury to debate. I mean, yeah, he killed him and he even admitted to it. But late in the afternoon on April 6, 1872, they returned a unanimous verdict, not guilty by reason of insanity. Everyone knew that he had killed George Merrett, but legally, he was innocent, right? Different times, different crimes, different jury, the whole setup. And the judge pronounced the sentence in language that sounded almost poetic, if you don't know what it means. They went to say, "You will be detained in safe custody, Dr. Miner, until Her Majesty's pleasure be known." Translation, he would be locked away indefinitely, basically for the rest of his life as the story unfolds. Now, Dr. William Miner, once a proud U.S. Army surgeon, once a member of the New England's most respected families, was now simply known as Broadmoor File Number 742, a certified criminal lunatic, and no one, nobody, could have predicted what he would do inside his cell for the next 30 years. So while Dr. Miner was being locked away in an asylum, something just as overwhelming was beginning to take shape literally just 50 miles away. The creation of the Oxford English Dictionary. Now, a lot of people think that the dictionary is something you knock off in a few years with a couple of few smart editors and some elbow grease. I mean, with today's technology, it would probably be that case. But this was not that. You have to remember, this is the late 1800s. No technology whatsoever. I mean, maybe a little bit, but nothing to that standard. This was an attempt to map the entire English language, not just define the words, but trace where they came from, how they were used, and how their meanings evolved over time. Every single word, every single meaning, backed by actual quotes from real sources. It wasn't just ambitious, it was unthinkable. And they needed examples from Chaucer, from Shakespeare, from the Bible, but also sailors' logs, political pamphlets, sermons, novels, and letters. Anything printed in English across the last 1,000 years, possibly even more. And by the time that the dictionary was completed in 1928, it had, again, like I said prior, taken over 70 years. When they first began the project, that they believed it would take literally just 4 years when they started. It spanned again across 12 volumes that literally weighed over 50 pounds. And some of the volumes themselves, like one volume, almost weighed 15 pounds. But the story really picks up, right? It took over 70 years, but the story really picks up in 1879 because that's when Dr. James Murray, the professor in the book that we're referencing, enters the scene. Now, Murray wasn't the obvious choice to lead one of the greatest intellectual projects in British history. He was born in a small Scottish market town in 1837. His father was a tailor. He left school at 14, and he had no private tutors and no elite universities. He was smart, self taught, but he wasn't one of the people that you would go to be like, yep, we're going to have you take control of one of the most ambitious projects in history. And so, when he was asked about his background, Murray once said, I am a nobody. Treat me as a solar myth or an irrational quantity, or ignore me altogether. But he never stopped learning. He devoured books, taught himself literally dozens of languages, and when life forced him to give up his academic dreams, when he had to move back to London and take a boring clerk job just to pay the bills, he never complained. He just kept learning. And what he once wrote for the British Museum listing all the languages he could read and write. It was a kind of a letter that would sound arrogant if it weren't true. But eventually, a scholar named Frederick Furnivall noticed him. Now, Furnivall was a kind of eccentric literary rock star who mentored brilliant misfits. He counted people like Tennyson, Ruskin among his friends, and one of his other proteges, Kenneth Grahame, went on to write The Wind in the Willows. Honestly, I don't know that book, but if you do, congratulations. Now, thanks to Furnivall, Murray got an invitation that would change his life. In April 1878, he called to a meeting at Christ Church, Oxford. The delegates of Oxford University Press had a project they wanted him to consider. They called it, at the time, a New English Dictionary on Historical Principles. I know, it's a mouthful. Murray would literally spend the rest of his life trying to build this project out. So now we've set the scene, right? There's a lot going on. We just learned that Dr. Minor, the madman in the story, is just convicted of murder, but he's not convicted of it legally. He's kind of insane, and so they put him in an asylum. So it's kind of like a jail, but it's not really, right? He's not in prison. He's more of in like a mental asylum at this time. And at the time, they didn't really understand like PTSD. They didn't understand schizophrenia, all these things that he was suffering with. They literally just labeled him as a lunatic, and he just shouldn't be out in the world. And then you've got Dr. Murray, who is the professor in this. He's a smart guy, but he's not one of the elites back in the day. But then he gets called up into this project, right? So the Oxford English Dictionary kind of started, I think, in like 1850s, but literally for 22 years, it never got off on the ground. They could never get any traction with it. And then they call this guy up, Dr. Murray, in 1878, and he is the one that absolutely changes the trajectory of it. One, because of his obsession with trying to complete this project. But then, as we'll see, when Dr. Minor steps on the scene, that's when things really start to ramp up. Now, before Dr. William Minor was known as a murderer or as a brilliant contributor to the Oxford English Dictionary, he was something else entirely. He was a child of missionaries, born in 1834 on the tropical island of Ceylon, which is now Sri Lanka. And this is one quote from the book that kind of gives you a little bit of a picture of his early childhood. So there are cinnamon and coconuts, and this is kind of explaining Sri Lanka. Coffee and tea, and there are sapphires and rubies, mangoes and cashews, elephants and leopards, and everywhere are rich, hot, sweetly moist breeze scented by the sea, spices and blossoms. And there were girls, young, chocolate-skinned, ever-giggling naked girls with sleek, wet bodies, rosebud nipples, long hairs, coatlish legs, and scarlet and purple petals folded behind their ears, who play in the white Indian Ocean, surf, and who run, quiet without shame, along the cool, wet sands on their way back home. It was these nameless village girls, the likes of whom who had frolicked naked in the Singalese surf for the scores of years past, just as they still do, that young William Chester Minor remembered most. Now, he came into the world in a mission clinic, raised in a strict, devout home surrounded around death and grief. Two of his half-brothers died young, and one of his sisters died at 21. And from age 13, Minor began battling with a shameful obsession that he just couldn't shake. A dark obsession, an oddly weird obsession about sex, and the guilt that he felt that would literally follow him with the rest of his life. And later in the story, you're going to see how crazy it gets, how lost his mind gets in all this when he eventually, I'll leave it for you. You just got to listen to the story to see what he does. It's absolutely insane. But by 14, his family sensed that he was getting a little too comfortable with these girls, or his sexual perversions were taking a hold of him too much. And so they sent him back out of the tropics, out of Sri Lanka, and back home. So they sent him back to the US to live with his uncle in New Haven, Connecticut. A clean slate, cold climate, a long way from temptation. And it worked, at least for a while. He was smart, brilliant, actually. He studied hard, passed his exams, and he was accepted into Yale Medical School. And by age 29, he had a degree in comparative anatomy and glowing letters of recommendation. Professors called him, literally, one of the half dozen best young physicians in the country. And then the Civil War came. Just 6 months into his career, he volunteered for the Union Army and was sent straight into hell. First came Gettysburg, the bloodiest battle of the entire war, and then the Battle of the Wilderness, a name that sounds a little bit poetic, but until you realize it was just forest fire mixed with gunfire and bloodshed. Now imagine this: wounded men screaming as trees burned around them, limbs torn off by bullets, and casualties everywhere. Some soldiers were burned alive when flames swept through the trees. Others crawled through the smoke and shattered legs, dragging themselves out of the fire. And even one of the soldiers wrote, "It seemed as though Christian men had turned to fiends, and hell itself had upspurred the place on earth." And Miner? Well, he was a surgeon in all this, and so he saw it all: amputations, gangrene, infection, primitive medicine, no anesthesia, no antiseptic, just saws and screaming and as much gore as you can think of. And if that wasn't enough, his duties also included something even darker: branding deserters. Now, what's interesting in the book, they talk about a little bit. What would happen is you had a lot of deaths in this, right? I think on the Union side, there was like 300,000, and on the Confederate side, there was like 200,000 deaths. So there's a lot of people dying. But there was also a big problem of people who were trying to desert the war. There were a lot of people who fled and got away scot-free. But there was also a lot of people who fled and were caught. And sometimes they were killed, but then the people who caught them were like, well, we're just dwindling our numbers, right? We're catching these runaways and we're just killing them. So we're dwindling and using our own ammunition. So instead, why don't we just torture them? And there was a lot of methods of torture, right? And they were pretty gruesome. But one of them was you would have to brand them. You would brand the letter D, literally burn it into them, into a man's body. Hot iron, either on the butt, the hip, or sometimes the cheek. And with Dr. Miner being the surgeon, he was tasked with branding these people. And in the book, it goes on to say, or else. And here it seemed was the perfect combination of pain and humiliation. He could be branded. The letter D would be seared onto his buttocks, his hip, or his cheek. It would be a letter 1.5 inches high. The regulations became quite specific on this point, and it would either be burned on with hot iron or cut with a razor, and the wound filled with black powder, both to cause irritation and indelibility. For some unknown reason, the regiment drummer boy would often be employed to administer the powder, or in that case, of the use of the branding iron, the doctor, which again was Dr. Miner. And in this, it was said at the London trial was what William Miner had been forced to do. Now, this was the beginning of his break. Now we know it in today's terms. He was probably suffering from extreme PTSD, but back in the day, they didn't really know about it, and so they just labeled him a lunatic. But this, more likely than not, is where he really started to crack mentally, right? You kind of saw a little bit with the sexual perversions and maybe the hardcore religion put on him kind of made him with the whole like sex and the grief and all that stuff. But this is probably where a lot of that PTSD comes from, and where he really starts to break mentally, become paranoid, and a lot of stuff like that. And so the men who had once shown so much promise, who painted watercolors, who quoted poetry, literally started to slip mentally. He became paranoid, he became angry, and he began to see enemies where there were none, which is why during the trial he kept thinking that people were following, they were poisoning him, they were hiding in the rafters, they were hiding under his bed, they were making a pimp of him, right? And so the army took notice. They quietly demoted him and sent him far away from the front lines to Fort Barrancas in Florida, a quiet outpost, obsolete and forgotten. And they were hoping that this isolation would help, but it didn't. His fellow officers noticed he was moody, sometimes aggressive, and they tried to help. He painted again, he kept to himself, but nothing worked. He just kept getting a little bit more insane. And in 1868, it was clear Dr. Miner was no longer fit for duty. One of the surviving letters from the book that the author found, written by someone trying to help him, begged for compassion. It says, he shrinks from what he regards as the stigma of medical treatment in a lunatic asylum. But the army had made its decision. They medically retired him with the official ruling, incapacitated by causes arising in the line of duty. Yeah, I would assume so with what he saw during the Civil War. He'd served his country, it broke him, and William Minor left the army as a walking ghost, a ward of the government. And this is what it says in the book. He passed through the stone gates, and this is kind of talking about his 18-month sentence that he had to go. It was somewhere in like Connecticut or somewhere close to his home. He served 18 months in basically the loony bin, but he hadn't killed anyone, so it was just an 18-month sentence. It says, he passed through the stone gates to begin with what would become a lifelong acquaintance with the inside of a lunatic asylum. The Washington institution, eventually renamed St. Elizabeth's, would become infamous. Ezra Pound would be detained there, as would John Hinckley, the attempted assassin of President Reagan. William Minor was to remain there for the next 18 months. He was a trusted inmate, however. The superintendent allowed him to run free of the gardens, then let him go unescorted into the nearby countryside. A century and a half ago, Washington was a very different place. Fields were now where now there are slums. He walked into town. He passed by the White House, and he visited to pay the office each month and drew his salary in cash. After 18 months, he was left free. So he needed an escape. He needed to get out of there. And that's when he sailed to England for a fresh start. So now that we've got a little bit of the background of Dr. Murray and Dr. Miner, and you can kind of see where a lot of this craziness starts to come from with Dr. Miner, it starts to make a little bit more sense, right? I mean, he was literally in a mental asylum for 18 months because he was losing it mentally, probably from, again, extreme PTSD, possibly schizophrenia, and who else knows, right? But they didn't really document it that well back in the day. And so now we have to jump into the history of the dictionary so you understand just how crazy it was to try and build this thing out. The date was November 5th, Guy Fawkes Day, 1857, which is when they really tried to upstart the Oxford English Dictionary. The time was shortly after 6, and the place a narrow terraced house on the northwest corner of one of London's most fashionable and aristocratic oases, St. James Square. On all sides were the grand townhouses and private clubs of the extraordinary number of bishops and peers and members of the Parliament who lived there. The finest shops in town were just a stone throws away, as well as the prettiest churches, the most splendid offices, and the oldest and most haughty of foreign embassies. 60 members were assembled at 6 o'clock on November evening. Darkness had fallen on London soon after 5:30. The gas lamps fizzed and sputtered, and on the corners of Piccadilly and Jeremiah Street, small boys were still collecting last-minute pennies for fireworks, the ragged models of old Guy Fawkes, soon to be burned on bonfires. Propped up before them, already in the distance, the whistles and crashes and hisses of exploding rockets and Roman candles could be heard, as early parties got underway. So the setting here was the birth, the idea for the Oxford English Dictionary, or, whatever they called it prior to what they actually call it now. And so you see, while the Oxford English Dictionary wasn't the first ever attempt at making a dictionary, it was the first one to undertake what would become the golden standard. Now, in the book, it does recount, and this is where I won't go into too much detail. If you want to read on it, it does have a lot of history on it. But it does have the history and the effort it took in the past to try and create a true dictionary. Basically, all you need to know is that while many people tried, it really wasn't that good. Most of it was just focused on either rare and uncommon words, and others were more tailored for people trying to learn the language better, but none were fully encompassing. And so the idea of the Oxford English Dictionary was trying to solve two main issues. Two matters were being ignored. The first was the need for a good dictionary to encompass the language in its entirety, the easy and popular words as well as the hard and obscure, the vocabulary of the common man as well as that of the learned house, the aristocrat, and the rarefied school. Everything should be included. The might of a two-letter preposition should have no less standing in an ideal world list than what the higher class may know. The second matter that the dictionary makers were ignoring was the coming recognition elsewhere that, with Britain and its influence now beginning to flourish in the world, with daring sailors like Drake and Raleigh and Frobisher, skimming the seas, with European arrivals bending before the might of the British power, and with new colonies securing founded in the Americas and India, which spread into English language and English concepts far beyond the shores of England, English was trembling on the verge of becoming a global language. It was starting to be an important vehicle for the conduct of international commerce, arms, and law. It was displacing French, Spanish, and Italian, and the country languages of its foreigners. It needed to be far better known and far better able to be properly learned. An inventory needed to be made of what was spoken, what was written, and what was read. And so the language then, therefore, should be accorded just the same dignity and respect as those other standards that science was then also defining. What is blue or yellow? Physicists were then wondering, how hot is boiling water? How long is a yard? How to define what musicians knew as middle C? What indeed of the precise measurement of longitude, so vital to seamen? Enormous efforts were being made in this particular field at just the same time as the debate over the national language. A board of longitude had been set up by the government, funds were being dispersed, and prizes offered just so that the clock could be invented that would go on a sea ship and be only almost in perpetuity, I can't really say that word, inaccurate. Longitude was vitally important. So great a trading nation as Britain needed to have its ships' masters know exactly where they were. The closest thing that they got to a dictionary was actually made by a man, Samuel Johnson, well, Dr. Samuel Johnson, in 1746. It goes on to say, as he finished amassing his list of English word stock in 1750, he spent the next 4 years editing the citations and choosing the 118,000 illustrative quotations, compared to the 1.8 million in the Oxford English Dictionary, sometimes by committing the hearsay of changing quotes that he didn't like. So his version of the dictionary, the golden standard during the 1750s, was very subjective. And finally, he completed the definitions of what were to become the 43,500 chosen headwords. He wrote some of these definitions from scratch, or else he borrowed substantial passages from from writers he admired. He did not publish the completed work until 1755, however, 5 years after, because he wanted to persuade Oxford University to grant him a degree, believing that if he was able to add his name on the title page, it would do Oxford, the booksellers, and most importantly, himself, and not necessarily in that order, a lot of good. Oxford agreed, and on April 15, 1755, Dr. Sam Johnson's dictionary was allowed into the world. And from that time, literally for another 100 years, this was the golden standard, the example of what a dictionary should be. And so the dictionary, the golden standard that they were talking about, was made by this one guy who had a tenth of what the Oxford English Dictionary had in 1928. And it was just really subjective. He used the words that he thought were fitting. He used definitions that he liked. And if he didn't like them, he would kind of change them or rearrange them however he liked. And he wasn't really a doctor. He just said that, like, hey, if you guys give me the doctor title, so that way we could put it on the book, it looks a little bit more official. But this was the best that they can come up with in 1750. And it is for this reason, in 1857, just a century after the publication of the first edition of Johnson's dictionary, there came a formal proposal for the making of a brand new work of truly stellar ambition, a lexicographical project that would be of far, far greater breadth and complexity than anything attempted before. It had a goal, a quite elegantly simple impertinence. While Johnson had presented a selection of the language, and an enormous selection of that brilliantly fashioned, this new project would literally present it all. Every word, every nuance, every shading of meaning and spelling and pronunciation, every twist of etymology, every possible illustrative citation from every English author. This, however, was only the idea. It took 22 more years of sporadic and sometimes desultory activity before the new dictionary truly got off the ground. And that's why January 7th, 1858, when the plan was adopted, is normally reckoned the starting point, at least on paper. Furnivall then issued a circular calling of volunteer readers. They could select from which period of history they would like to read the books. from 1250 to 1526, the year of the New English Testament, from then to 1674, the year that when Milton died, or from 1674 to what was then present day. Each period, it was felt, represented the existence of different trends in the development of the English language. Each volunteer would take a slip of paper, right at the top left hand of the target word, and below, also on the left, the date of the details that followed. These were, in order, the title of the book or paper, its volume and page number, and then below that, the full sentence illustrated to use of that target word. It was a technique that had been undertaken by lexicographers. Sorry, I completely fucked that word up. To the present day. So basically, you would take your target word. Let's say you want to do art. You would say where you found it, what book, when it was made, the page number, and then the definition and the different types of ways that it could be used. If it was a noun, a verb, an adjective, all that types of things. And they would literally have to do this for every single word, every single way that it could be used, and every single citation that they found it at by hand, and then have to reorder all of that in alphabetical order. Like, I think you're starting to see just how absolutely insane that this project was. Again, in the late 1800s, no technology, no ChatGPT. He estimated that the first volume of dictionary would be available to the world within 2 years. He thought this entire project would take 2 years. And were it not for the dilatoriness of many contributors, he wrote, clearly in a touchy mood, I should not hesitate to name an earlier period. So he was so cocksure that it wouldn't just take 2 years, it would probably take less than 2 years. And everything about these forecasts was magnificently wrong. In the end, more than 6 million slips of paper came in from volunteers, and Coleridge's dreamy estimate that it might take 2 years to have the first saleable section of the dictionary off the presses, for it was to be sold in parts to help keep revenues coming in, was wrong by a factor of 10. It was this kind of woefully naive underestimate of work, time, and money that at the first so hindered the dictionary's advance. No one had a clue what they were up against. They were marching blindfolded through molasses. And so finally, on March 1st, 1879, almost a quarter of a century after the speech by Richard Chenevaux Trench, a document was formally agreed upon. James Murray was to edit, Dr. James Murray, the professor in the book, on behalf of the Philological Society of London, the New English Dictionary of Historical Principles, which became the Oxford English Dictionary, which would spread itself across an estimated 7,000 quarto pages in 4 thick volumes and then take 10 years to complete. So they were like, no, sorry, the 2 years was a little, we were a little optimistic. This one's actually just going to take 10 years. It was still a woeful underestimate, but the work was now beginning properly, and this time it was never to stop. And within days, Murray had made 2 vital decisions. The first one is that he would build a corrugated iron shed in the grounds of Mill Hill School, and he would call it the Scriptorium, the first of 2 specially built for his headquarters, and would edit the Great Dictionary from there. And now, the Scriptorium was literally this iron shed where he had literally every word in the English dictionary, which, he created, and he would literally alphabetize it and go through what these volunteers sent him, and he would write it down in alphabetical order and make sure that every word was in there in their proper placement. Like, absolutely insane. Now, we'll get later into the story in this, but just the word art took over 5 days to document. One word. The section T literally took him over 5 years to complete. And so you can see like how massive of a project this was. And the second thing that he implemented is that he would write and have published a 4-page appeal to the English-speaking and the English-reading public for a vast, fresh corps of volunteers. It was basically just an ad going out, hoping that he would get volunteers for the project, because while he couldn't go out and find words, he needed to make sure that he had words coming in, so he had a steady flow of work always going on so he can continue the project. And sometime in the late 1880s, one copy at least, left inside a book or slipped between the page of a learned journal, found its way to one of 2 large cellars on the top floor of Block 2 at Broadmoor Asylum for the criminally insane in Crowthorne, Berkshire. It was read voraciously by Dr. William Miner, a man for whom books, with which one of his 2 cells was lined from floor to ceiling, had become his second life. Dr. Miner had been an inmate at Broadmoor for the previous 8 years. He was deluded, true, but he was a sensitive and intelligent man, a graduate of Yale, and well read and curious. He was, understandably, preternaturally anxious to have something useful to do, something that might occupy the weeks and months and years and decades that stretched without limit. Again, his sentence, until Her Majesty's pleasure be known, before him. This invitation from a Dr. James Murray of Mill Hill, Middlesex, NW, it seemed, promised an opportunity for an intellectual stimulus and perhaps even a measure of personal redemption that was far better than any he could otherwise imagine. He could write immediately. And so, by the time that Dr. William Miner entered Broadmoor Asylum in 1872, he was just a haunted man, paranoid, brilliant, and legally insane. According to his intake file, he was a thin, pale, sharp-featured man with sandy-colored hair, deep-set eyes, and a demeanor of someone who hadn't slept in a long time. His official classification, dangerous to others. He told the doctors that he was being poisoned, still with the paranoia, that the lower classes were out to get him, that strangers slipped into his room at night and tormented him, or made a pimp of him. Broadmoor was no paradise. And now we're going to talk a little bit about where he was actually staying at, right? It wasn't a prison, but it kind of had that feel. It was designed by the same people who built the Pentonville and Dartmoor, two of England's most forbidding prisons. The cell blocks were dark red brick and the windows were barred and the walls were topped with iron spikes and broken glass. So, no crazy people would get out. But Miner was different. He wasn't just any patient. He had a U.S. Army pension, a formal education from Yale, and an air of dignity that, while cracked, was still a little bit intact. Right? A lot of the paranoia and the craziness came at night. During the day, he was a little bit better, but when it came nighttime, that's when his demons came out, kind of like schizophrenia. It's like a symptom of split mind. And so essentially, day and night, he was like a completely different person. Unlike most other cellmates or inmates, he was actually given 2 cells. One was for him and another literally a private suite. So he was in Broadmoor as a criminally insane lunatic. And because of his status, his history, and, his VA disability money, he was actually given 2 rooms. One room he turned into a study, literally floor to ceiling bookshelves, a writing desk, and a reading chair. He even hired another inmate to tidy up and help organize all his papers. Life, as strange as it sounds, actually kind of became a little bit comfortable for him. He painted watercolors, played the flute, and walked the terrace on nice days. But when the sun went down is when the delusions returned and he really went into his paranoia. And the doctors kept notes on him, a couple chilling ones. In 1873, they wrote, "He appears rational by day, but at night he barricades his door with furniture and ties string from the door a handle to his bed, so he'll wake if someone tries to enter." Later entries only grew darker. He believes poison is poured into his mouth through a funnel, the electric currents are passed through his body, that he's dragged across the countryside, taken to constable to perform lewd acts in public. They are, as he told an attendant, trying to make a pimp of me. He really liked using that word in this book. But then something unexpected happened. After being housed in Broadmoor for several years, 8 years to be exact, he actually wrote a letter. And it was addressed to Eliza Merrett. Now, you might remember that last name because it is the widow of the man that he murdered. Miner told her that he was sorry, that he wanted to help. He offered money and support for their children, right? I mean, he did kill him out of cold blood for no reason. And so he kind of wanted a little bit of redemption. He felt bad. He reached out to her. And to everyone's surprise, she actually accepted. And then she did something even more surprising. She actually began to visit him, not just once, but on multiple occasions. Month after month, she would literally bring parcels, packages wrapped in brown paper and sealed with wax, books for Dr. Miner because he requested them, and lots of them from the best shops in London. And again, tucked away in one of those parcels, left there by accident, by some chance of fate, sometime in the early 1880s, was a flyer, a request from a man named Dr. James Murray asking for volunteers to help with the dictionary. Miner read it, And that's when everything changed. And so now for Dr. Miner, there was something to do, something that he can contribute to, a mission, a purpose, and maybe in his head, a form of redemption. It goes on to say, after a decade of languishing in the dark slough of imprisonment, intellectual isolation, and remove, Miner felt that the last thing he was being hoisted back up into in the sunlit uplands of the scholarship. And with that, he saw as this reenlistment into the ranks. So Miner's self-worth began, at least marginally, to reemerge, to begin seeping back. From the little evidence that survives in his medical records, he appears to have started recovering his confidence and even his contentment, both with every moment that he spent reading Dr. Murray's acceptance letters, and then he prepared to embark on his self-set task. For a while, he seemed truly happier. Even the sternly worded Victorian ward notes of the day hint that the temper of this usually suspicious, broody, prematurely elderly-looking middle-aged man, he was now approaching 50 at this time, somehow started to turn. His personality was undergoing, even if for just a short while, a sea change, and all because, at long last, he had something valuable to do. Now, Murray had left detailed instructions for volunteers in these ads. Each quote should be written on a slip of paper. The target word, again, on the top left, the date just below that, then the source, author title, page number, and finally, the full sentence describing it using the definition of where they found it and how it can be used. Miner didn't just follow the directions, he elevated it basically into an art form. He took 4 sheets of white paper, folded them into a quire, an 8-page booklet. With a bottle of black ink and a pen with the finest nib he could find, he began reading his chosen book, line by line, word by word, and he started with A. Every time a word caught his eye, he logged it. A microscopic handwriting, alphabetized, cross-referenced. Let's say he came across the word buffoon on page 34. He write it neatly in his place, leaving room in case another B word came along that needed to fit below it or after it. A few pages later, balk in it went just above, then blab right between them. Each entry was precise, and he understood where this would line up. It was something in his head that he kind of just knew the spacing of all this. And not just the word, but its spelling, its position, its page number, its usage. What he created was something close to a dictionary within a dictionary, a kind of a word Rolodex, only he could understand, but it was absolutely brilliant. And from atom to azure, foresight to heart, and his list grew. Some words appeared 16 times like feel in every shade and form. And by the mid-1880s, something strange had begun to happen in the quiet Oxford village of Mill Hill. Packets started arriving. Small at first, modest brown parcels of paper clips, each one 6 inches by 4, filled with meticulous notes in perfectly neat, slightly curled American handwriting. At first, they trickled in every month, then every week, and then almost literally daily. It goes on to say the first slips of snow white, unlined paper, 6 inches by 4, and covered with William Miner's neat, elaborative cursive, and so distinctively American handwriting in greenish black ink, began to drift out from Broadmoor post room in the spring of 1885. By the late summer, they were arriving at their destination in small brown paper packs every month, and then larger packs every week. Before long, the gentle shower of paper had turned into a raging blizzard, one that would howl up from Cawthorne unceasingly for almost the next 20 years. And soon what started as a soft flurry turned into a blizzard, a storm of words and quotations sent from one place just literally 50 miles away. And that's the crazy thing. Where the Oxford English Dictionary, where Dr. Murray was doing all of his citations and everything in his scriptorium, just 50 miles away was Dr. Miner in this asylum, sending him these. And so the return address, Cawthorne, to James Murray, it was simple. He figured that the man was just a retired physician, maybe a bookish doctor with some time on his hands and a love for language. He had no idea that the man fueling the heart of his dictionary was locked in an asylum for murder. And so Murray had taken over the Oxford English Dictionary project in 1879, and to say it was overwhelming would be an understatement. It was literally, not literally, but figuratively, an impossible task. Literally thousands, hundreds of thousands of words to define, millions of usages to verify. Every citation, every source, every shade of meaning had to be recorded, organized, and written by hand. The system inside the scriptorium was literally military in nature. Slips would come in by the tens of thousands, each one reviewed, sorted by word, sorted again by parts of speech, and then laid out on long tables on the floor like a giant game of semantic chess. And this is what they say. This is what he wrote in just kind of giving you a picture of how crazy this process was for him. Only those who have made the experiment know the bewilderment with which the editor or the sub-editor, after he has appropriate, oh my gosh, apportioned the quotations for such a word as above among 20, 30, or 40 groups, and furnished each of these with a provisional definition, spreads them out on a table or on the floor where he can obtain a general survey of the whole, and spends hour after hour in shifting them about like pieces on a chessboard, striving to find them in fragmentary evidence as an incomplete historical record, such a sequence of meaning as may form a logical chain of development. Sometimes the quest seems hopeless. Recently, for example, the word art utterly baffled me for several days. Something he had done with it. Something was done and put in type, but the renewed consideration of it in print, with the greater facility of reading in comparison with which this afforded, led to the entire pulling of pieces and reconstruction of the edifice, extending to several columns of type. And yet, sometimes, despite the mountain of material, one word could literally grind the whole machine to a halt. And one of those words, like I said, was art. And so Murray and his team tried. They divided art into 16 meanings. And they assembled them into sentences. They defined them and redefined them and rewrote them. And still something was just off. And so what they did was, with an overwhelmed editorial team, they would ask for help. And so they sent out to all their volunteers. They were like, hey, do you guys have anything on art? Can you help us out with this? And they sent it out. Everyone that sent things back, it was like one or two things that they found on art. 18 people responded. Most of them, again, just sent one or two quotes. But Minor sent 27 different pieces of material on the word art itself. Each one was different, precise, and illuminating. Some from obscure text, others from forgotten sources. Every one of them exactly what the team needed. They literally could not believe it. They called him a rare find in the book. Prolific, scholarly, and tireless. But they still didn't know who he was. And meanwhile, inside Broadmoor, the picture was very different, right? He was by day getting all this done and he had a purpose, but again, by night, his paranoia was still taking over. And so inside Broadmoor, it was a very different picture. During the day, Dr. Miner was calm and focused, reading, annotating, building his personal word Rolodex. But at night, the demons returned, and his medical team reports read like a fever dream. 4 cakes stolen, his flute gone, he was a frog marched up and down the corridor. Villagers snuck in to abuse him, attendants used his body, electricity shot through his limbs. They were trying to make a pimp of me. And yet, day by day, he returned to the slips. This was literally his therapy. This was his meaning. And in 1888, 9 years after work had formally begun, the first volume of the dictionary was published. Literally just every word from A to B. 9 years to do 2 of the 26 letters in the English dictionary. Hundreds of pages, thousands of definitions, an entire team of scholars behind it. And in the preface, buried in a single line, was a name, Dr. W.C. Miner of Crowthorne. No fanfare, no explanation, just quiet, formal gratitude. But for Miner, it meant everything. He saw this as a form of redemption, something that he could put his cause into, and he was getting a little bit of that feedback. His name in print tied to something that actually mattered. But still, Murray was puzzled at this point. He'd written to Dr. Miner several times. He'd asked to meet him, invited him to Oxford, suggested a visit to the scriptorium. Nothing. Which raised a fair question. If this man lives literally just 50 miles away, literally just a single train ride away, if he was so curious, so brilliant, and so passionate, why hadn't he ever showed up? Why had no one ever seen him? Who was this man, really? And so this is where we kind of get into where they finally actually meet after 20 years. Modern literary myth maintains, even today, the strangest puzzle surrounding William Chester Miner's career was this. Just why did he not attend the Great Dictionary Dinner, a dinner to which he was invited, held in Oxford on the glittering evening of Tuesday, October 12th, 1897? In 1897, the University of Oxford had done something to celebrate the dictionary and what it's done so far. After decades of agony and effort, the Oxford English Dictionary had published its first volume, again, just the letters A and B. The new vice chancellor decided they'd mark the occasion in proper Oxford fashion, with a massive dinner at Queen's College. Guests arrived under stone arches, summoned by the blast of silver trumpets. The Times called it the greatest effort probably which any university, it may be in any printing press, has taken in hand since the invention of printing. Scholars came, so did donors, editors, and all the volunteers, even people who contributed literally just a couple of pieces of paper. It was the who's who's of Victorian academia. Everybody showed up, except for two guys. The first was Dr. Fitzward Hall, an American Sanskrit scholar whose eccentric isolation was the stuff of legend. Everyone sort of expected Hall wouldn't come because he was a recluse, known for his grudges and kind of odd habits. He had a good reason for avoiding crowds. But the second was different because no one could explain it, and that was Dr. William Miner. He lived literally just 60 minutes away down the train line of Crawthorne. He wasn't antisocial. I mean, when he wrote, his letters were polite, warm, and articulate. And so why wasn't he there? The question stayed with Dr. James Murray long after the last glass was raised. And so Murray did what he probably should have done years ago. He wrote a letter to Dr. Miner. You and I have known each other through correspondence for fully 17 years, he said. It is a sad fact that we have never met. I have long wanted to meet you. May I perhaps suggest that I come visit you? Miner wrote back immediately, gracious, apologetic, and agreeable. He suggested a few train times and offered to meet Murray, have someone meet him at the train station near his home, which was Broadmoor, the insane asylum. Murray, still none the wiser, picked a Wednesday in November and set off, expecting to meet a kind, eccentric gentleman tucked away in a quiet country refinement. He arrived at the gates of Broadmoor, and he was escorted to the main office of the warden. When finally in the office of the warden, Murray assumed that this was Dr. Miner. This was the guy that he was corresponding with for over 17 years. He stepped forward, extended his hand, and said, I, sir, am Dr. James Murray. You must be Dr. Miner, and I am deeply honored to finally meet you. The man paused. I regret not, sir. I am the superintendent of the Broadmoor Criminal Lunatic Asylum. Dr. Miner is an American and one of our longest staying inmates. The words hit him like a slap. Dr. Murray, stoic, scholarly, always composed, was stunned. The man who had sent in tens of thousands of quotations, who had rescued the word art, who helped mold the entire dictionary together, was locked in a cell for the criminal lunatic. And finally, the two met, scholar and madman. Except now that line didn't seem so clear. And to make things even stranger, they kind of looked like twins with what it said in the book. In the book, it says, for both men, the first sight of the other must have been peculiar indeed, for they were uncannily similar in appearance. Both were tall, thin, and bald. Both had deeply hooded blue eyes, neither using spectacles, though Miner was profoundly myopic. Dr. Miner's nose looked a little hooked, Dr. Murray's finger and more aquiline. Miner had an air of avuncular kindness. Murray much the same, but with a trace of the severity that might well distinguish a lowland Scot from a Connecticut Yankee. But what was most obvious, similar about these two men, were their beards. In both cases, white, long, and nicely swallow-tailed, with thick mustaches, sideburns, and ample bugger grips. Both looked like a popular illustration of Father Time. Boys in Oxford would see Murray tricycling and call out Father Christmas at him. When the beards were added to the other collections of the pair's individual attributes, each must have imagined for a second that he was stepping towards himself in a looking glass rather than meeting a stranger. The two men met dozens of times in the next several years. By all accounts, they liked each other, a liking subject only to Dr. Miner's moods. to which Murray became, over the years, fully sensitive. But again, like it says, this was not a one-time visit. Over the next several years, they met again and again and again, and he would come to visit him pretty frequently. Murray became Miner's closest link to the outside world. He'd visit to talk, share progress, and ask for help on certain things. He'd write Miner's name publicly and proudly and credited him whenever it was possible. And by this point, Miner had already submitted over 12,000 quotations, so Miner wrote in a book, "We could easily illustrate the last 4 centuries from his contributions alone." Pretty lofty appraisal. But the visits became less frequent. Both men were growing old, they were growing weak, and maybe both of them were losing their minds a little bit from this dictionary. And so that's when things began to slip down. Miner, as always, was fading again. Broadmoor had changed leadership. The old kind warden was gone. The new one, Dr. Brain, was stricter and less compassionate. Miner's privileges were cut, his access to books were limited, his walks reduced, and his letters delayed. Murray knew. He wrote to him more, tried to visit as he could, but by now Miner was slipping into despair. I mean, this new guy that came into Broadmoor literally almost revoked all of his things. He literally took away one of his cells that had his books, his chair, his reading, all of it. And so as he began to lose his purpose, as he began to lose the ability to contribute to the dictionary, his mind started to tumble down and he really started to lose it. I mean, here's kind of how bad it gets. By the early 1900s, the great minds who carried the Oxford English Dictionary this far were growing old, but none were fading faster than the man in cell block 2, patient number 742. It happened on a cold morning in December 1902. Dr. Miner walked calmly to the lower gate of Broadmoor Asylum and called out to an attendant, "You'd better send for the medical office at once. I've injured myself." At first, no one realized what he meant. But when the staff reached him, Miner told them plainly he had cut off his own penis. He had tied a string around it to stop the bleeding, used a sharp knife, waited, and then with a single clean motion, amputated it. A doctor through and through, he knew how to do it just right. There was almost no blood. Why? Because in his mind, this was penance, a punishment for decades of imagined sin, years of obsession, masturbation, and sexual guilt that had morphed into this religious torment. Again, when we talked about Dr. Miner, when he was younger, he was a family of missionaries, and he had this weird sexual urge, again, kind of with his mental instability. And for years, this tormented him, eventually to the point where, he cut his own dick off. And so this was his way of throwing the organ into the fire. And then he lay down and just waited for help. And the way that the book describes it is that when he did it, he was almost calm when he did it. Like, it wasn't like he cut his own penis off and then he was screaming and asking for help. He was just very calm, went over to the attendants and was like, "Hey, you better get someone, like, kind of just lopped my own penis off." And so this wasn't a breakdown. It was something a little bit more slower. It was a spiritual surrender. Miner had become convinced that his body was a source of evil, that he had to destroy it piece by piece. And with the arrival of a new, harsher warden at Broadmoor, many of the small privileges that made his life bearable, his walks, his books, his privacy, began to disappear. And he unraveled faster. He grew frail, angry, and lonely. And it says in the book, and there were further dispiriting developments. In early March 1910, Dr. Brain, whom history will probably not judge kindly in the specific case of William Miner, ordered that all the man's old privileges be taken away. Miner was given just a day's notice to quit the suite of 2 rooms that he had occupied for the previous 37 years, to leave behind his volumes of books, to give up his access to his writing table, his sketch pads, and his flutes, and move into the asylum infirmary. It was a cruel outrage committed by a vengeful man, quite likely jealousy of the burgeoning reputation of his charge, and angry letters poured in from few remaining friends who heard the news. But just when it seemed that there was nothing left to lose, fate somehow intervened. Because the man that was now serving as Britain's Home Secretary was Winston Churchill. Yes, that Winston Churchill. Not yet the wartime legend he became, Churchill was still in his early 30s. Ambitious, articulate, and unusually sympathetic to Americans, thanks to his mom being American. Miner's case landed on his desk in 1910. A summary was prepared and quietly reviewed. He was a man who had committed a murder, yes, but since spending nearly 4 decades in an asylum, submitting thousands of scholarly contributions to the Oxford English Dictionary, and who was now frail, aging, and clearly no threat to anyone but himself, Churchill didn't grandstand. He didn't make a speech. He simply signed a warrant of conditional discharge in blue ink, stating that Dr. Miner could go on one condition. He had to leave the United Kingdom and never return. There was no court hearing, no chains, no guards. Miner's brother, Alfred, still running the family's China shop in New Haven, crossed the Atlantic, met him at the gates of Broadmoor, and escorted him, calm, respectfully, back home. No incidents, no panic, no night terrors. Literally, they signed off by Winston Churchill that he could leave the asylum in Britain, but he had to go back home to New Haven and go into a new asylum there. And instead of like escorting him in this huge parade and making a big deal of it, they were just like, they hit his brother up and they were like, hey, can you take your brother back to New Haven? Like, he's kind of done a sentence and he's probably going to die pretty soon. And they were like, yep. And so his brother literally took him out into the world, out into the public, took him back home. And then that was kind of it. Like, that was the right times were so different. And so after 38 long years, William Miner walked out of the asylum gates as a free man. And while he never saw England again, he had finally escaped the four walls that had defined his life, and in some strange way had helped give him meaning again. And he lived out the rest of his life as an American asylum near his home in New Haven, surrounded by a family that cared for him in peace. And as the science of the day slowly caught up, a new understanding emerged. Right, Dr. Miner had likely suffered from schizophrenia, compounded by the extreme PTSD from his time in the Civil War as a surgeon. He wasn't just a madman; he was a casualty of war, of trauma, and a mind too brilliant and too broken to hold itself together. But by then, the end was near, and one by one, the other pillars of the Oxford English Dictionary began to fall. Frederick Furnivall, the eccentric rowing lexicographer who helped bring Murray into the world, into the project, or not into the world, but into the project of the OED, died in 1910. And then Dr. James Murray, who had led the effort for nearly 4 decades, passed away in 1915. He had just completed the letter T, 5 years of labor for one letter. He had always suspected that he wouldn't live to see the end, but he had essentially made peace with it. For the last photo of him, thin and tired, was taken in the scriptorium, surrounded by shelves, daughters, and decades of devotion. And finally, on March 26, 1920, Dr. William Chester Miner died at the young age of 85. And the dictionary he helped build wasn't finished until 1928. And so this project literally lasted longer than any of these men could have ever seen it been accomplished. Again, in 1928, it was finally completed and the last volume was shipped out. 12 massive volumes, 414,825 words, 1.8 million quotations. And it goes on to say, the total length of type, all handset for the books were done by letterpress, still discernible in the delicately impressed feel of the inked on paper is 178 miles if you laid it out, the distance between London and the outskirts of Manchester, discounting every punctuation mark in every space, with any printer knows occupy just as much time as a set does a single letter. There were no fewer than 227 million letters and numbers in all 12 volumes. With the first word in the dictionary being A, literally just a single letter A is definite, like a cat, a book. The dictionary actually devotes 4 full pages to this, just to the usages, etymology, and the historical forms of A. And the last word being zixt. It's the second person singular present tense of the Old English verb to see. It comes from the Kentish dialect and is in kind of like an archaic form. I mean, you'd never really hear someone say it today. Maybe after this podcast you will. But it held the honor of being the final word in the 1928 edition. I haven't looked it up, but I don't know if that's still the last word. It would be interesting to kind of check that out. And of those millions of citations, Tens of thousands came from a man locked in a room who mailed them in from behind bars. And one editor said, "We could illustrate the last 4 centuries of the English language from Dr. Miner's contributions alone." And maybe that's the strange poetry of it all. Because in a world that he couldn't understand, and with a mind that often betrayed him, William Miner still found something to give. He couldn't fix the past, he couldn't quiet the voices, but he could define a word. And that's the story of the dictionary that defined a language and the madman who helped build it. Now, often with these books, I like to create 2 episodes for these books. The one focusing on the context, the story, the narrative of it all, and the second to really break down what we can learn from the lessons of the book, right? Kind of give you the context, the narrative, and then what we can learn from it, how we can apply it to our everyday life. And while this story spans over hundreds of centuries of work to create this one book, there was really only one takeaway that really stuck with me here. So instead of making a completely separate episode on just one lesson, it's going to go at the end of this episode. So if you've made it this far, congratulations. And more importantly, thank you so much. Now, let me read an excerpt from the book that kind of ties in this lesson. Nearly all of them, if treated with compassion and good chemistry, can have some kind of dignified life, of a kind that was denied for so much of his time to Dr. Miner, except, of course, that Miner had his dictionary work. And there, in a cruel irony, is this, that if he had been treated, he might have never felt impelled to do work on it as he did, by offering him mood-altering sedatives as they would have done in Edwardian times, or treating him as today with such antipsychotic drugs as whatever drugs that he lists out. Many of his symptoms of madness might have gone away, but he might well have felt disinclined or unable to perform his work for Dr. Murray. In a sense, doing all those dictionary slips was his medication. In a way, they became his therapy. The routine of his quiet and cell-bound intellectual stimulus, month upon month, year upon year, appears to have provided him with the least measure of release from his paranoia. His sad situation only worsened when that stimulus was gone. Now, William Miner killed a man in the street. Then he saved 10,000 words from being forgotten in the Oxford English Dictionary. Both stories are true. By day, he combed through old books, traced old roots of English words, and by night, he fought ghosts only he could see. His madness never left him, but his purpose gave it somewhere to go. It didn't make him whole, but it gave him something to do. And we think obsession is dangerous, and it could be. Being consumed is much worse. Miner was obsessed with words. Most people today are consumed by noise. And so there's this really interesting, I don't know if this is the right word, but dichotomy between them. Obsession, when put towards a good use, can serve us. It can be good for us. But obsession without a purpose, without a meaning, is just consumption. It consumes us, and that's not good. We can think of it today in modern times as TikTok, porn, scrolling through Netflix, outrage that we might see on the internet. These things don't destroy us all at once. They dissolve us over time. And the difference between being obsessed and being consumed, well, obsession gives you structure when it's directed in the right way. When it's not directed, consumption steals your time, your energy, and your life. Now, Miner had no freedom, no family, no future, but he had a task, a reason to get up and a reason to work, something to put his mind to. And it steadied him for longer than anyone expected, for almost 30 years. He didn't need healing, he needed meaning. And while it didn't completely fix him, it did fix him during the day, and it gave him something to do for multiple decades. And for us, the world will never run out of distractions. But if you don't anchor your mind to something that matters, it will anchor itself to something that doesn't. Obsession is only dangerous when it serves nothing. Purpose is the leash that ties you down to your own madness. And in A Man's Search for Meaning, written by Viktor Frankl, he writes about surviving Auschwitz. It's an amazing book. I'll definitely make an episode on it. But he saw that people who lived weren't always the strongest or the fittest. They were the ones who had a reason to live. And he goes on to say, quote, "Those who have a why to live can bear almost any how. Minor didn't have freedom, but he had his why, which was the Oxford English Dictionary. And that was enough for a while until it was taken away from him. Now, purpose won't save you, but it will keep you from giving up. And my message to you is that it's okay to be obsessed when it serves a good purpose. And that purpose doesn't need to be something that's grand, like building a unicorn startup or discovering cancer. For some, it might be finding your own obsessions and let everything else that consumes you fall away, because obsession paired with a purpose that's important to you is good. But when an obsession has no direction to follow, it consumes you. And so the difference between obsession and being consumed is just the difference of, does it have meaning and does it serve you? And so that's the lesson I want to leave you with today. If you guys enjoyed this episode, if you made it this far, honestly, thank you so much. Like, I read these books and I want to tell the stories of them. And honestly, selfishly, I do it for myself because I want to learn about these stories. And kind of how Richard Feynman said, the best way to learn something is to teach it. And so that's kind of my goal, selfishly, is to read these books, talk about them, and then just talk about the lessons that I've learned. But if you guys find, or if you find any value in this, that's my life's work. That's my obsession, and directed towards a good cause. I'm hoping that it doesn't consume me and it lets all other things fall away at the wayside. So go ahead and find your obsession and don't feel bad about it. Just make sure it has a purpose, and that purpose doesn't have to be anything grand in the world's eyes. It just needs to be worth it in your eyes. Till the next one, I'll see you guys then.